Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
I am Gene Hollander, a Vice President of the Peninsula Seniors. I welcome you to another Peninsula Seniors Education Lecture, which is held weekly at the Hesse Park in Rancho Palos Verdes. The lecture today will cover the role of an organization called Guerilla Beekeepers. And we're going to learn all of the insides and outsides of bee caring and beekeeping. Please welcome Mr. Bill Walters.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to giving you a little bit about information about bees. And this is a lecture that I call Beekeeping 101 or Honeybee 101. And it's just some good basic information about honeybees and what they are, what they do for us, why we need them, and what we can do to help them. My company is called Guerilla Beekeepers. Guerilla beekeeping was a term that was coined up in Manhattan. People there wanted to keep bees in the city, and it was illegal. And so one of the things that they would do, they would take their hive boxes and they would place them on rooftops, and they would paint them to look like air conditioners, or they'd paint them to look like planters so that no one would know the bees were there. And they lobbied the city council and lobbied the city council, and eventually beekeeping was legalized. But hiding those hives was called guerrilla beekeeping. And so one of the things that I do is I do hives in urban placements. You know, if in appropriate areas, I can place a hive in someone's backyard. Tend to maintain it. It's for people that want to have bees close by but don't want to be a full-on beekeeper. The thing about Southern California, this is one of the best places in the country for bees. Most of them are descended from Italian stock, and we have the same Mediterranean climate, so they absolutely flourish here. Excuse me. So, like I said, if a yard is appropriate, you know, I can put a hive there. And the thing is, we already have bees. We have bees everywhere here. I think by tending them and maintaining them and making sure they are of good disposition, you know, that way we can, you know, better interact with the bees. If a hive becomes mean, for instance, I can always requeen it with a nicer queen. So I think that's one of the main reasons why I think beekeeping should probably be legalized. Granted, there should be restrictions on it. It should be done in a safe manner. But I think it's something that really deserves consideration. So at any rate, my company, I do live honeybee removal, and that's where I get my stock from. A lot of people buy bees. I prefer to work with feral bees, wild bees, bees that are adapted to the local conditions. This is one of my favorite quotes. The keeping of bees is like the direction of sunbeams, or like telling sunbeams where to go. I wake up every morning and I have this plan about what I'm going to do with the bees that day, how I'm going to maintain my hives, what I'm going to do to remove them, and the bees always get a vote. And things rarely go as planned. So pardon me? Things rarely go as planned, so you have to stay on your toes when you work with bees. Their behavior is really predictable in a lot of ways, but they are always coming up with new and interesting ways of fooling me. So this is Honeybee 101. So the honeybee as we know it has been around for over 35 million years. And she's descended from an ancestor, at least the earliest ancestor that we know of, that was found in Burma, roughly 100 million years old. And one of the oldest depictions that we have of humans interacting with honeybees is from the Cava de Arana in Spain. And it's from roughly 10 to 15,000 years ago. If you look, you can see a woman climbing a tree. She's reaching into the bole of a tree to pull out the honeycomb, and the bees are flying around her, and she's probably getting stung a lot. And even today, honey hunters in Tibet risk their lives for honey. So imagine, 50,000 years ago, the only sweets that people had were fruits, things like that. And then they discovered honey, this concentrated nectar from the flowers. It was absolutely the food of the gods. In fact, honey has been so important and so influential, it plays a role in every major religion. So that first interaction that we know of 10 to 15,000 years ago, about 2400 BC, the first evidence that we have that people actually began keeping bees, 2400 BC with the Egyptians. They were the first ones that actually took the bees, placed them into some sort of enclosure, something that was man-made, and actually tended them and took care of them. And that's a actual hieroglyphic of a bee carved in stone from 2400 years ago. The amazing thing, though, is, okay, honey. I have a lot of people ask me about honey. How long does it last? What do I need to do? You don't do anything at all to it. Keep it in a cool, dark place. Honey is the only food that does not spoil. They have found honey from this time, from 2400 BC, that's still edible. Another question I get is, what's a honeybee look like? Or, I have these things flying around my yard. What are they? So, two of the things that people get confused with honeybees are yellow jackets and paper wasps. So, the easiest way to tell them apart is yellow jackets, you can see, are dark black, bright yellow, and shiny. They have a hard carapace, a hard shell. Paper wasps have a narrow thorax that connects to their abdomen. Honeybees, on the other hand, on the very bottom down there, they're usually brown and black, or a golden color and black, and they're fuzzy. And they look kind of cute, actually. And that fuzz actually is to help them when they are foraging on flowers to collect pollen. They're actually, the bees carry a small negative electrostatic charge. And when they go into the flowers, the pollen sticks to them, to all that fuzz. And then they rake it all off, and they have 2 pollen baskets, one on the back of each leg, and they pack that pollen in there, and then they fly back with it. And one of the other big questions I get is, what are the types of bees in the hive, and how many queens are in the hive, and things like that. So there's only ever 1 queen in a hive. 2 queens can't coexist. They will fight until one of them's dead. So the gestation period, 16 to 18 days for a queen. The lifespan, she can live 2 to 5 years. And right now, especially now during the season when it's warm and the flowers have started to bloom, the sun's shining, she can be laying up to 2,000 eggs a day, which is actually more than her body weight. And let me show you one thing really quickly. I removed this yesterday. This is 1 sheet of comb. There were 4 others about this size in the hive that I removed. Another comment or statement that I get is, people say, yeah, I had bees, but I thought they would leave. No, they won't. And if the queen is laying 2,000 eggs a day, you can imagine how many bees she could wind up with. So this is a really good example of how big a hive can actually get. So imagine this. If this was full of honey, it would probably weigh 40 pounds. So there's only ever 1 queen in a hive. Workers, however, different story. In a hive, in a good-sized hive, say in this hive box, for instance, in that lower box, there could be 40,000 bees in that box. A good-sized colony is anywhere between 40 and 80,000. A big colony can range upwards of 250,000 bees. But the thing is, there's only about 5,000 to the pound. So they go a long way. But like I said, they could be anywhere between, upwards of 80,000 bees in a colony easily. Their gestation period is 21 days. They have a lifespan of about 5 to 6 weeks. They spend the first 3 weeks inside the hive doing housekeeping duties, taking care of the baby bees, relieving the incoming foragers of their nectar and pollen and storing it in the cells. They're the ones that are responsible for ripening the nectar into honey. Then after about 2 weeks or so, the house bees, the nurse bees, come down to the entrance of the hive. And then they become guard bees. And it's great. You can see them at the entrance to the hive. A bee will come flying in, and a guard bee will come running over to it and basically interrogate it. Make sure that it smells right, that it's from the right colony, and that it has food. And if it does, it'll let it in. If a bee shows up empty and it doesn't smell right, it's a robber bee, and they'll chase it off and they'll fight it. If a bee from another colony, however, shows up and it's loaded with nectar, if it's just gotten lost, which happens all the time, the incoming bee from a foreign hive will bribe the guard bees with food and the guards will let them in, because at that point they're just, you know, seen as another asset for the colony. So the workers, every single one of them female. They're the ones that do all the work. And the other type of bee in the colony is a drone bee, the males. All they do is mate. That's all they're good for. They don't sting, they don't forage, they don't do anything else for the colony. They're only for the purpose of mating. Usually the drone population about this time of year is, you know, anywhere between 5 and 10% of the colony. Not very much. Not many of them are needed. And at the end of the spring, or, you know, when the summer comes along and the flowers stop blooming, all of the workers will kick the drones out because they're no longer necessary, and they starve to death. Yeah, I know. All the women always laugh maniacally when I when I throw that fact out. So their only purpose is to mate. And as a little side note, one of the most interesting things I've found out about honeybee biology is, from a biological standpoint, bees have no fathers. Okay. So the queen has a chromosomal set that is diploid. She has a set of chromosomes from her and then from another genetic donor. The workers also have a diploid chromosomal set, but the drones only have a haploid chromosomal set. They have one set of chromosomes, only their queen's chromosomes. So when they go out to mate with a virgin queen, they're only carrying their own queen's DNA. They're not carrying anything of theirs. Unlike humans, where you have, you know, a male and a female are both adding genetics to the mix. The drones are just a carrier of the queen's genetics. So essentially, it's just two queens mating. So I've always found that absolutely fascinating. From a biological standpoint, there are no male bees. They're just carriers. They're just messengers. So, like I said, a really healthy colony can contain upwards of 250,000 bees. I've seen hives that size before. I spotted one in an attic in Corona, had been there for about 5 years. Imagine if you took a football, cut the top third of it off, stuck it at the top of the attic, and then made it as tall as me, and roughly that big around. It's the largest hive I've ever seen in my entire life. It was like something out of a horror movie. And hopefully I won't ever run into one that size ever again. Because as the colonies get larger, they become more defensive around their hives. So another important thing about honeybee biology is not to think of the honeybees as the individual bees. That whole colony is what we call a superorganism. The entire thing is an animal. That whole colony, the worker bees, the queen, the drones, the comb that they have in there is the equivalent of our skeleton and our part of our reproductive system. That whole colony is an integrated organism. So when we do removals, we have to be very careful to not damage the bees, not damage the queen, not damage the drones. And also when we're removing the comb, be very careful, because that's where the baby bees are. That's where they have their stores of nectar and pollen. You know, that comb essentially is their life. It takes them a tremendous amount of resources to build that comb too. For every 1 pound of beeswax that those bees make, they have to consume about 8 pounds of honey. So if I take that comb away from them, they have to do a tremendous amount of work to build it back up. And so that comb that I showed you, you know, that's probably 3 to 4 pounds of comb, maybe 5. So you know, you're talking at least 25 pounds of honey just to make that. Bees can't make wax without nectar or honey. They have to have a carbohydrate source. And they have 2 little wax glands, one under each foreleg, and they secrete these millimeter-long flakes of wax. They secrete billions of them, and they fashion them into the little hexagonal cells that we're all familiar with. So as I said, the majority of the bees that we have in Southern California, Orange County in particular, are of Italian descent. We brought them here. They were bred specifically to be good honey producers, not to swarm too terribly often, to be relatively docile, and you know, just so that we could work with them easily. And because we have that exact same Mediterranean climate, Southern California is absolute bee heaven. Basically, if you haven't had bees get into your house or jacuzzi or irrigation box, you probably know someone who has, or chances are you're probably going to have them at some point because they are absolutely everywhere, and they only need a 1/4 inch hole to get into a structure, and it's very difficult to actually bee-proof a structure. Basically, there are two what I call classes of groups of bees. We have swarms and we have colonies. A swarm is a group of bees that are in transition. A colony is established inside a wall, inside a tree, inside something else. They have comb built. A swarm doesn't have any comb. So, like I said, bees, that colony is a superorganism. The whole thing is an animal. So when it's time to reproduce, when the sun's shining, it's warm, the flowers are blooming, that's the bee's signal to reproduce. So that colony, like an amoeba, will divide in half. The old queen will take half of the bees and leave, and then they'll ball up in a tree or something like that. You've probably all seen the big ball of bees hanging there. And what they're doing is they're sending out scouts now to look for a new place to live. So if you see a swarm like that, it's a good idea to call someone to have it removed. A lot of people will say, yes, they're going to leave probably within 24 to 48 hours. But the thing is, they're going to go somewhere. So if we can capture that swarm and recover it, we've saved that colony of bees. Also, only about 1 in 10 swarms survive in the wild. And so if we can capture those swarms and take care of them and give them a better chance, we'll have that many more good, healthy bees around. So a colony is an established hive. They've got comb. And like I said, they've got that comb they use for storage of food. They use that comb for raising their brood. The queen lays eggs in the cells. They use it for storage of pollen. Bees basically only eat 2 things, nectar and pollen, and sunshine. That's about it. When they're a swarm, they're much easier to remove. They're out in the open. And also, if you see a swarm of bees or a big cloud of bees, it can be very frightening having all those bees in the air, but actually when they're swarming, they're at their most gentle. Bees are only defensive when they have a colony or a hive to defend. And if they're away from their colony, for starters, they have absolutely no interest in you. Once they figure out that you're not a threat or a flower, they really don't care. And because a swarm has no hive, no comb or anything like that to defend, they are not defensive. In fact, if you are slow and gentle, you can actually walk up and you can pet them. I love doing that. So as far as defensive behavior in bees, the best advice I give people, never swat at them and never breathe on them or blow on them. Those 2 things will get you stung faster than about anything else, and that's most people's natural reaction. If there's a bug flying around your head, you start swatting at it and blowing on it. They see that swatting as aggressive behavior, and they'll follow that motion, and then they'll recognize your face and they'll come right after your eyes usually. And when you breathe on them or blow on them, the carbon dioxide from your breath will trigger a defensive response in them, and they'll follow that to get to your face. They like to sting you around the eyes and the mouth because it hurts really badly, but it really won't incapacitate you, but it will make you want to leave the area. So bees will generally give you 2 warnings before they sting you. The first is they'll start flying around you very erratically and buzzing very loudly, and they're trying to get your attention. And they're letting you know that they're not really happy with you being there at all. And they want you to go somewhere else. If you ignore that warning, they'll actually start bumping into you, and they'll start bopping into your head. It's known behavior. It's called headbutting. And basically what the bees are doing, they're saying, go away, go away, go away. And they want you to leave it. You should leave the area immediately. Try not to run. The best thing to do, tuck your hands under your arms, look down so they can't really see your face, hold your breath a little bit, and just walk away as quickly as possible. Because if you're running really hard, they'll see that motion of your hands as a swatting motion. So that's probably the best advice I can give you if you are dealing with bees. But like I said, if you're far enough away from their colony, they don't care. But if you ignore the 2 warnings that they give you, then they will sting you. But for the most part, they don't want to, because when they sting you, they die. And in defense of the colony, they're willing to do that. But if they're out foraging on the flowers, they don't really care. They're not trying to defend the hive at that point. They're far away from where they are. If they die when they're out foraging, they haven't done the colony any good. They haven't defended the colony, and they're not going to bring back their load of food. And so Remember I said bees are 5,000 to the pound. They're tiny, tiny little things. People ask me how much honey a bee will make. A bee makes 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in its entire lifetime, which is about one cell, one of those little tiny little hexagonal cells inside a hive. And they have to visit about 2 million flowers to make 1 pound of honey. So for every pound of honey that you consume, 2 million flowers. The bees had to visit 2 million flowers. They'll travel roughly twice around the earth for every pound of honey. I almost feel guilty when I harvest it sometimes because they work so hard for it. Honeybees get into absolutely everything. If you've had them, you know. They get into stucco walls. They love stucco. Cellular antennosites. For some reason in the fall, when it starts getting cool, they like getting near these, I think, because it keeps them warm, the microwave radiation. I don't particularly like working near cell antennas for the same reason that the bees like it. They get into chimneys. You'll see them coming and going in the crack of the chimney on the outside between the chimney and the wall. Usually they're getting into the void in the front of the chimney. In that case, the easiest way to remove it is to go through the sheetrock. They get into vents. They get under hot tubs. They get into hot tubs and jacuzzis. They love those little slatted louvered doors on those things. And then they get up in there and they build that comb all around the inside, all around the tubing, all around the pipes, because it's a nice enclosed space. It's nice and warm, and they can easily defend it. And those louvers give them a nice little door to come and go from. They get into crawl spaces under houses. They get into utility vaults. They get up under people's eaves. And irrigation boxes. We take them out of irrigation boxes all the time. You just about couldn't build a better enclosure for bees. It's the right dimension, the right volume in the ground, so the temperature is moderated all the time. It's nice and cool in there in the summer. And there's this perfect little 1/4 inch opening that the bees absolutely love, and it lets them come and go as they want and keeps a lot of the critters out that they don't like. So yeah, these things are absolutely perfect for bees. If I couldn't have designed a better thing for them to live in. Rooftops, attics. They get into attics a lot. They love getting down there near the right where the rafters meet the top plate of the wall, which is always interesting to remove them down there, because usually you're laying on your side covered in honey, insulation, and angry bees, which is it's always a fun thing. The one thing about bee removal is you have to be willing to work for low pay, long hours, and being stung by bees all day. Other than that, it's absolutely fantastic. And it's all the honey you can eat, too, which is actually good for me because I probably eat about a quart of honey a month. I'm an absolute honey junkie. That's one of the things that keeps me going. And cellular antennosites. This is the same one. The bees came back. They didn't seal up the openings. And that's the one thing I always tell people. You got to seal the openings. You have to seal the openings. You have to seal the openings. This year, I've already been back to about 6 different places that I went to last year because the space where the bees wasn't sealed up. And they will come back, because basically if one bee colony finds your home or business or structure acceptable, essentially all bee colonies have the same behavior. So basically every bee colony in the world is going to find that spot acceptable. And not only that, but even when you've removed the colony, there's still traces of wax that can't be removed. And the bees can smell that for up to 5 years. So they will come back and come back and come back. We do live bee removal. Like I said, that's the source for our stock, because we like recovering the feral bees, the wild bees. Like I said, you can buy bees. They're called package bees. You buy about 3 pounds of bees and a queen. But those bees haven't been bred for the local conditions. But I like working with bees that have been specifically bred to survive in the areas where they were recovered. These are the bees that tend to be more hygienic. They tend to groom themselves more often and get rid of the mites that they get. They're not necessarily quite as nice as package bees, but that's a trade-off, because these bees were bred to survive. As far as temperament of bees goes, bee colonies, just like people, they all have different personalities, believe it or not. Some of them are nice and sweet and gentle. I can go out, I can work my hives with no gloves on, no smoke, and those bees will do anything for me in the world. And then, just like some other people that will knife you and take your wallet, there are bees like that as well. Whenever I wind up with a hot hive, we call them a hot hive. Whenever I wind up with a hot hive, what I can do is I can requeen that hive with a gentler queen. And so she will give birth to a preponderance of offspring that are of better disposition. And as the mean bees, the mean workers cycle out and the new ones come in, the hive will get nicer and nicer and nicer. And then eventually I've got a nice colony of bees again. But you have to put up with a lot of stinging to get to that point. So we need bees for pollination. It's a huge issue for us. Bees aren't native to the United States. You know, they were brought here. They're not a native pollinator. But we have come to rely on them for pollination. Our entire agricultural system is based on pollination by honeybees. So here's a short list of some of the crops that are pollinated by bees. There are over 300 crops that are dependent upon external pollinators. And while there are some native pollinators, nothing matches the sheer horsepower of honeybees for pollination. Like I said, in that one box, there could be 40,000 bees in there. And all they do all day long is fly back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, up to 100 trips a day, out foraging, bringing back nectar, bringing back pollen. And incidentally, while they're foraging and bringing back pollen, they're cross-pollinating plants. So we absolutely require them. Almonds, there would be no almonds were it not for external pollinators. They rely 100% on honeybees for pollination. In fact, the almond growers pay beekeepers about $160 per hive for 4 weeks to set their hives out in the almond fields in February and pollinate the almonds. So the pollination industry is absolutely huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And every year, the growers send representatives to the different beekeeping clubs and solicit beekeepers to bring their bees up. And basically a third of our food, honeybees are directly responsible for. So for every third mouthful of food you eat, thank a bee. Okay, everyone has heard about colony collapse disorder. CCD is a huge problem. So, basically the bees are dying and we didn't know why for the longest time. So in the morning, you go out, you check your bees, you've got this great big healthy hive, overflowing with bees, lots of activity, everything looks good. And a few days later you go back, hive's empty, there's no one in there, there's some baby bees that are hatching out still. There's a queen walking around in there because she won't leave, and there's no workers. Nobody's bringing back food. And for the longest time, we didn't know what the problem was because there weren't any bodies to examine. There weren't any piles of dead bees lying around the beehives. What we're finding out now is there's a new class of systemic pesticides called neonicotinoids. And they coat the seeds of the plants. The seed sprout absorbs the poison into the plant. The plant itself becomes mildly toxic. These neonicotinoids interfere with the bee's ability to navigate. Okay, when you're only 5/8 of an inch long and you're flying for up to 5 miles to find food, the ability to navigate is imperative. So basically these bees fly out, forage on these contaminated plants, and then they can't remember how to get back home. So no food goes into the hive. It's a huge problem here still in the US. It was a huge problem in Europe. But France, Germany, Italy, they've banned neonicotinoid poisons. There was a lot of evidence that suggested that these were the problem, and the governments there weren't listening to it. And eventually, the French beekeepers rioted, as the French are sometimes wont to do, and they were taking their hive bodies, because they had no bees, they were taking their hive bodies, they were setting them on fire, and they were outside the Bayer plant. Bayer's the company that makes these poisons, and they were throwing their flaming hive bodies over the wall. And eventually, the governments got the message, and they banned the use of neonicotinoids. They don't have a problem with colony collapse anymore. Unfortunately, we still have that problem here because we're still using the poisons. And the toxicity studies that were done on the neonicotinoids were done by Bayer. And unfortunately, here it's a lot of little people like me and fighting against great big corporation. If we could get rid of these things, that would be one half of the problem that we're having with disappearing bees. Fortunately, where I have a lot of my bees, they're on organic farms. And in urban locations, I'm not really exposed to them, so it's not a big problem for me. But When everything in the Central Valley is in bloom, there are barely enough bees in the United States to pollinate them all. And if we keep losing bees at the rate we're losing them, it's going to be a significant problem. So, what can we as individuals do? Contact your local representatives. Ask them why we're still using these poisons. Let people know. So I do what's called treatment-free beekeeping. Just as a matter of course, unfortunately, most beekeepers will prophylactically medicate their bees with antibiotics. And just like with people, when antibiotics are improperly applied, it builds stronger diseases. Also, bees get mites. A mite called the varroa mite was introduced into the United States maybe 8 or 10 years ago and has spread like wildfire. Basically, these mites, if you took your fist and put it on your body, that'd be about the same relative size a varroa mite is to a bee. And they're little vampires, basically. They latch on and they just suck the juices out of the bees. They get into the cells, into the little hexagonal cells, and they predate the larvae. And the baby bees hatch out, they're stunted, their wings are useless, and they can't provide for the colony. Varroa can wipe out a weak colony in no time at all. And so there are miticides that can be used for these things, but just like antibiotics, if they're improperly applied, they actually build pesticide-resistant mites, which now we have a huge problem with those. So both of those things, antibiotics, not so great for you. Miticides, definitely not very good for you. In fact, using those miticides in a hive is kind of like chemo on the hive. You're basically trying to kill a bug on another bug. And a lot of the time, the cure is just as bad as the disease. Queens are often killed by using these miticides. They're very, very toxic. And the problem is, too, all these chemicals they're fat soluble, which means they wind up in the wax and they stay there. Wax acts like a sponge and it holds on to these things. And then because the honey is being stored in the wax, now you've got traces of antibiotics and miticides in the honey. So when we first started beekeeping, we did nothing to the bees but put them in a box. Then we started treating them and giving them all kinds of miticides and antibiotics and things like that, and interfering with what they do. And now what we're trying to do is get back around to the other side of the circle again and figure out how to do absolutely nothing to the bees and still keep them healthy. There's a small but really rapidly growing number of us that are starting to practice these beekeeping methods. It requires more work. It's kind of like the organic farming of the beekeeping world. We actually have to practice good animal husbandry. We have to take care of our bees. We have to make sure that they're not stressed, that they're in good environments. We have to get in periodically and check on their health. But for me, it's worth it because now I've got a honey crop that doesn't have anything in it other than honey. So one of the things I do, we have what's called integrated pest management techniques. So for instance, for those varroa mites, instead of using a miticide on those, I can use powdered sugar. I can use powdered sugar. So those mites have little suction cup feet, and they hang on to the bees with them. The powdered sugar crystals are the same size as the suction cups. So what I do is if I have a weak colony that has varroa, I can open that hive up, take a sieve, sprinkle the whole thing, everything in there with powdered sugar. And so now the mites can't hang on to the bees, they fall off. I use a bottom board on the hive that has a screen on the bottom. The mites fall out of the hive and they can't get back in. They can't climb back up. And not only that, but I've just fed my bees. All this food just fell out of the sky. So the bees actually really like it when I do that. So by doing that now, I haven't done anything to the bees that would be detrimental to them. Nothing goes into my hives that I personally won't eat because eventually I'm going to be eating things that come out of that hive. In fact, there's nothing you can't eat in a beehive. There's absolutely nothing you can't eat in there. The honey, obviously, pollen, yeah. You can even eat the brood. I've tried it just to say I did. They have kind of a nutty flavor, but I don't think I'll ever try them again. And actually, so when bears are ripping into a beehive, they're not after the honey. The honey's just dessert. They're actually after the baby bees because they're more interested in the protein than they are in the carbohydrate. But like I said, basically the honey's just dessert when it's all said and done. So honey can be up to 49% something else. and still be labeled pure on the front of the label. They have to list the other ingredients on the back. It can be high fructose corn syrup, it can be barley syrup, but as long as it's 51% honey, it can still be labeled on the front of the label as pure. There's a lot of shenanigans that go on in the honey industry right now. And also, if you see honey that's labeled USDA organic, it did not come from the United States. At present, there is no USDA organic standard for domestically produced honey. So if it's labeled organic, it didn't come from this country, and then we're just taking the producer's word for it. And essentially, to be labeled organic, you have to know the provenance of the land for 3.5 miles around your hives. Here in the United States, that's almost impossible. There are only 3 or 4 beekeepers in the entire U.S. that would qualify for the organic standard. I belong to an organic beekeeping association. We meet in Arizona every year to discuss methods of treatment-free beekeeping, and we also have a liaison to the USDA. And the big honey industry pushes one way, we push back the other way. We're trying to develop a meaningful standard and keep that organic standard from being watered down. There is going to be an organic standard for U.S. honey, and hopefully, we will make it meaningful. So that's one of the big things that I'm also pushing for. So basically, anyone could become a beekeeper. I can't do that. I have enough trouble when I'm wearing a suit and bees are crawling all over me. In order to do that, though, it's really interesting. The queen gives off a pheromone. It's called queen substance. And in order, they'll use that to make these bee beards. They'll take that queen pheromone and put it on them. And the bees will just naturally gather around it because they want to be near the queen. They just like being near her, and so they'll put it all over them, and the bees will, form a beard or a shirt or whatever. I can't do that. If you're interested in beekeeping, it's a really, really easy activity to get into, and one that can actually be very pleasurable. If you've got a nice hive, you can literally stand from here to your hive. The bees will just come and go. They don't care about you. As long as you're not doing anything threatening to them, they don't care. Just standing there is fine. They may land on you for a moment. You're just a convenient place to hang out for a minute or two. Once they discover you're not a flower, they'll leave. They don't care. So basic beekeeping tools haven't really changed much in several hundred years. Really, really simple. You need gloves because you do handle them. If you accidentally squish one, they'll sting you in the fingers, which is really uncomfortable. You'll need a little bee brush to sort of herd them around, and also if their hair gets messed up, you can take care of them that way. This is an absolutely essential tool. It's a smoker. Everyone's probably seen one of these or seen beekeepers using them. Big, thick clouds of smoke billowing out of them. Basically, this is the equivalent of a lion tamer's whip. You basically cannot work bees without a smoker. I use burlap and hunks of beeswax. It generates a nice cool smoke that doesn't cook the bees. It's not acrid because I have to breathe some of it too. And what that does is, I have a lot of people ask me, so what does this smoke do? Does it put them to sleep? Does it make them drowsy? The smoke actually does 2 things. So when bees communicate, imagine the inside of the hive, it's dark. You can't see. So bees communicate by means of vibration and scent, or pheromones. When a bee gets upset, it gives off, we call it an alarm pheromone. And that one bee will get upset, it'll give off that pheromone. Other bees will pick it up. They'll get upset, they'll give off the pheromone, and more and more and more. And you have this whole cascade reaction then. And then the whole colony, as a superorganism, is coming out after you, trying to drive you away. So the smoke does 2 things. It masks that pheromone, the smell of it, so that individually the bees will get upset, but as a group, they don't know that everybody else is upset too. So they're very disorganized about coming after you. The second thing is, bees live in a house made out of wood and wax. Fire is a huge, huge issue for bees. So all of a sudden, I'm the secondary problem. They're more worried about their home burning up. So they start getting ready to leave. So they have a thing called a crop, a honey stomach, and it's above their digestive stomach, and they can carry nectar around in it. So they start sucking all the nectar and honey out of the cells in anticipation of having to leave. And it's really funny too, when you open up a hive after you've smoked them, you'll see all the bees with their heads down in the cells and their little butts sticking out, because they're just furiously sucking up that nectar to try, because they're probably going to have to leave pretty soon. And the second thing is that's really nice. So they're not paying much attention to me. The second thing, though, is when they get full, it's harder for them to bend, so it's harder for them to sting. So they're a lot less inclined to sting. And this is the bee suit that I wear. And so basically it's a full suit. You don't have to wear a full suit. I do removal, so I need it. I'm exposed to a lot more angry bees than most normal people would. A veil to keep the bees out. People ask me, so do you get stung? And I get stung on average every day. And well, they say, well, they can't sting through the suit, can they? Well, there's a little tag that comes with every suit you buy. It says this suit is sting resistant, not sting proof. So basically, it'll keep them honest, but if they want to sting you, they're going to. And the thing is, most people's interaction with bees was when they were a kid. They were running around out in the grass, stepped on a bee, and it stung them, and it really, really hurt because you're really small. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people remember. I never have gotten used to it. It makes me yell every time it happens, and it really makes me want to be somewhere else. But at least now I've developed a pretty hefty immunity to the venom. It hurts for about a minute or two. It's just like a mosquito bite for 10 minutes, and it goes away. But I still don't enjoy it. I'm not macho about it. And any other beekeepers that say, oh yeah, it doesn't hurt, doesn't hurt. Well, no, they're lying. It does hurt. And basically the other tool you need, a scraper and a hive tool, basically. Get in there. The bees will glue everything together with this stuff called propolis made from plant resins. You have to pry things apart. You have to remove excess wax. You just want to keep the hive nice and clean inside because you need to be able to get the frames out in order to inspect the hive, make sure it's healthy, and then ultimately to harvest the honey. The last thing, common sense, probably good thing if you don't have any to do this. And then the last thing, woodenware. So you've got a hive. I'll show you really quickly what's going on in the hive. So a lot of you have probably seen bee boxes sitting out in a field, but not many people get to see what is actually inside them. I prefer working with wooden boxes. The bees seem to like it better. Some people use plastic, some use styrofoam. I like to keep things as close to a hollow tree as possible. That's what the bees like. That's what they really love to be in. I also don't like to paint my woodenware just because I like the color of the wood. Some people like painting them white. It helps keep the temperature down because the bees are constantly maintaining the temperature inside this hive. And the comb, they always keep the comb at 93 degrees. It can be 110 outside, the comb is going to be 93. It could be 30 degrees outside, the comb is going to be 93 degrees. So we have a bottom board, a big box. We call this a deep, a thing in the middle called a queen excluder, which I'll show you. And then on top, a super, because it goes above, or a honey super. This is what I get to harvest. And then a wooden top. So the bees live in this box. This is where basically I keep them. Usually I keep them in minimum of 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 boxes high. Sometimes they're taller than me. I like my colonies to be big. That means I have an army of bees to go out and forage for me. 2 colonies of 30,000 bees won't make as much honey as 1 colony of 60,000. Colony of 60,000 will make about 1/3 again as much honey. The housekeeping duties stay the same, but now I've got more foragers. So here's that screen bottom board I was telling you about. Mites fall through that, can't get back into the hive. And this also allows for good ventilation because we have really warm weather around here. So inside this hive box are 10 frames. I do what's called foundationless beekeeping. meaning that when I give them a frame, it's empty, except for a little popsicle stick that I glue on top, rub it with beeswax. And if you can imagine 10 of these in a row, there's like this little speed bump all the way down the middle. And basically that gives the bees a good idea of where to start. You can't tell them, you just have to sort of suggest things, because like I said, they always get a vote. And sometimes they'll draw the comb out at a 45-degree angle if you don't pay attention to them, and then that's a mess. So here is what the comb starts out with. So you can see they're hanging it from the center here, but they're also keeping it in line. And then they'll add more to it. And then eventually, they'll fill out that entire frame until I've got something that looks like that. And one of the good indicators of the age of a hive, too, is the color of the comb. As the comb ages and the bees use it, it gets darker and darker and darker. Every time a bee hatches out of one of these cells, it leaves a little residue behind from its cocoon and things like that. And then you've also got to figure there's millions of dirty little bee feet walking all over this comb all the time. So as the comb gets older, it gets darker. You can see this is a lot lighter. And you know, when people ask me when I'm doing a removal, how long has the hive been there? One of the good indicators is the darkness and toughness of the comb. The new comb is really light, white, fragile, very delicate. This stuff, yeah, it gets really, really hard with age. It's really, really durable at this point. So this is was called out of one of my hives. It's probably been used for about a year, a little over a year. There is my foundation. So this comb was built on foundation. You've seen it's a wax sheet basically, or a plastic sheet. It's got little hexagons stamped out on it. They're all the same size, and you get these nice, neat, even rows, which looks really nice, and they're very sturdy. But this is another one of the problems with quote-unquote traditional beekeeping. Remember those mites I told you about, the varroa mites? They like to go after the drones, because the drone bees, the males, they're those great big burly bees, and the workers actually build bigger cells for them. The varroa like those bigger cells. They like the drones. They don't like the workers so much. But we decided how big these cells should be, and they're bigger than the bees want to make normally. The theory being bigger bees carry more nectar, make more honey. But they didn't really account for the laws of physics, and so now we've got these great big lumbering bees that are really slow. They don't make as many trips, and they get picked off by predators more easily. So that's one of the reasons that I do foundationless. I let the bees build the size they want, which is much smaller than this. And the last thing I want to show you, when I do removals, I'll take the comb and I'll affix it to the frame with rubber bands temporarily, and then the bees will attach it back to the top of the frame, and then they'll fill out the rest of the frame and keep going just like nothing ever happened. And then if you take a look at the bees that I have later, these were just recovered about 3 days ago, and I've still got the rubber bands holding all the comb in, so you can take a look at that. So in this bottom box, they can store about, here in California, Southern California, they'll store about 40 pounds of honey in there to get them through the winter. The honey is for times of dearth, when there are no flowers blooming. In fact, the bees that are making the honey now, they only live 6 weeks. They're not ever going to eat that honey. It's only for the ones that are going to make it through the winter. So 40 pounds of honey in here, that'll get them through the winter. And then I'll put this is called a queen excluder. The worker bees can fit through here. The queen's too big. She can't. So basically, I've trapped her down in the bottom box. Then I put on this smaller box, 10 frames. Same thing basically, same configuration, just shorter. This is where the bees are going to store the honey. So everything they leave here, everything they put in here, I leave for them. They have to have this. But bees, when they're happy and healthy, will naturally produce excess. That's what they do. Everything that goes in here is mine. I get to have this. And the thing is, a lot of people say, oh yeah, you're taking advantage of the bees. No, I'm not. If they're not happy and healthy, they don't make excess. So basically I'm working for them, and I'm working cheap. But in this honey super, in each one of these frames, when it's filled with honey, it could weigh 3 to 5 pounds. I've got 10 of them in here. This thing could weigh up to 50 pounds when it's full of honey. And honey is just unbelievably heavy stuff. And yeah, carting these things around when they are absolutely full of honey is it's quite a workout. You'd think something that's so small, it's amazing, something that is so small, everything that's involved in working with it is heavy. So here's one that's a partial. I actually broke this comb. I'm sorry. When it gets cold, it gets brittle. But you know, this is one that they're still working on. They haven't drawn it all the way out yet. I've actually managed to convince a couple of vegans that it's actually more than a number of vegans that it's okay to eat honey, because you know they were saying, oh, you're exploiting the bees, you're exploiting the bees. No, I'm not. Like I said, I'm working for them. If they're not happy, they don't make excess honey, which means you know I don't have a honey crop to sell. And then the last thing, wooden top. And basically that's where I keep them. I've got about 80 of those. And as a hobby beekeeper, it's great. You got 1 or 2 hives, a couple of hours a month. When you start getting up like this, it actually starts to become work. This seemed like a really, really good idea at the time, and and then it turned into a job. I've actually worked as a graphic designer, a web developer for about 20 years, and then started doing this as a hobby. Somebody called me up one day, a friend of mine said, you know about bees, right? And you know, I said, okay, yeah, why? And I said, well, I've got friends with bees in a wall, can you get them out? And so I did, and got another call and another call and another call, and realized that in Southern California, there's a viable business in honeybee removal. They're all over the place, and not only that, but the bees that I'm saving, we call those the survivor bees. Like I said, those are the ones that have adapted to the stronger bees and the diseases and stronger mites out there. So those are the ones that I want to save. When I get a good colony, I'll take that colony, I'll split it, I'll propagate those good genetics, actively fighting against all of the, you know, the diseases and things like that that are, you know, that are continuously plaguing bees. So if you're interested in being a beekeeper, there's a lot of good beekeeping clubs. We love having new people come. We love ruining your lives like ours were ruined by other beekeepers. So if you're interested, you know, there's a great club in La Mirada, the Backwards Beekeepers up in LA, wonderful group of people. They will welcome you in with open arms because, like I said, it's a very enjoyable pastime and doesn't require much effort. So if you're interested, yes, you too can become a beekeeper. That's basically all I have. Okay, so the question from the audience is, what do I do with all of the honey that I wind up with? Because there could easily be 50 pounds of honey inside this box. Like I said, because I'm doing treatment-free beekeeping, I'm not using any chemicals in my hive whatsoever. There's nothing in my honey except what the bees bring back from the forest. And I'm very proud of that. It's a lot of extra work, but you know, for me it's worth it. So when I do the extraction, I'll take a fully capped frame of honey, because when it's ripened, the bees cap all these cells with wax. I'll take it's called a capping scratcher. It looks like a curry comb, and I'll take off those cappings to expose the honey, and I'll take 10 of these frames and put them in a centrifuge, and then I'll spin them, and it slings the honey out, and then I decant it through a strainer and straight into a bottle. That's all the processing it gets, and it's all done at room temperature because there are all of these volatiles and aromatics in there that just give it such a wonderful, rich flavor. A really good quality honey is like a really good quality wine. It should be handled very gently, shouldn't be heated. A lot of commercial honeys are heated to make them flow through the processing equipment more quickly, and that drives off a lot of the really good flavors. So all of my honey is processed at room temperature, and then I'll take this frame, and because it takes 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax for the bees, I'll give them this frame back put it back in the hive. They'll repair what little bit of damage I did to it, and then they'll fill it back up for me again. And because it still has honey on it when I give it back to them, now they got snacks while they're working. I do live bee removal as an alternative to extermination. People ask me, so where do you go? What areas do you service? Well, I come up to the Palos Verdes Peninsula. I'm down in San Pedro, down in Orange County. One of my favorite places up here, though, where I have removed bees is Terranea out on the peninsula. It's an absolutely beautiful view. Those are some of the happiest bees that I've run into. It's a beautiful, beautiful area for them. And there are a lot of businesses that have decided to become better corporate citizens and not kill bees when basically they can have them removed for no more than it would cost to kill them. So when I come give a talk, I really like to bring live bees, because it's something not a lot of people get to see. So this is a colony that was recovered from an irrigation box 4 or 5 days ago. Very tiny little colony, still very delicate. And as you can see, there's rubber bands crisscrossing the frames. When I do a removal, I'll take the comb, temporarily mount it in the frames with rubber bands just to hold it in place. And then the bees eventually will connect it to the top of the frame, to the bottom of the frame, and then they'll fill the entire frame out with comb. And then the rubber bands, those don't belong in the hive, and the bees know it, and they can't stand anything in the hive that doesn't belong there. So once they've gotten the comb far enough along in its repair to where it will stay, they'll chew those rubber bands up, and they'll drag them outside, and they'll throw them out the front door of the hive, and you'll see this pile of rubber bands littering the ground. Because the bees don't allow anything inside the hive that doesn't belong there. So what you're seeing now is very typical activity inside a hive. In the lower frame down here, you can see all the bees all clustered together on the comb. What they're doing is they are tending to the baby bees. They are taking nectar and storing it in the cells. And somewhere in there, if you have patience, you can find the queen. She's about twice the size of a regular bee, but she's long and slender. And her sole job is to lay eggs. She's the only one in the colony that reproduces. She is the source of all the bees in this colony. Every single one of these bees is her daughter. It's kind of hard to see her right now because this isn't really a natural situation for the bees. They're exposed. They like being in the dark. And so right now you can see all the bees clustered together on the bottom. Most likely the queen, there's a good chance she's down in here somewhere, because the bees, the worker bees, will protect her, and they'll hide her because they don't want anything to happen to her. Because if the queen dies and they can't raise another, there's no more colony. There won't be any more baby bees.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.